What do you do when the world's most powerful warship starts sailing straight toward your coastline and you have no way to stop it? Right now, a second American aircraft carrier is cutting through the water toward the Middle East, and inside Iran's command centers, something close to panic is setting in. Before we go any further, if you want the full breakdown of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. Subscribe if this is your first time here, and if you know someone who's been asking what's really going on with Iran and the US Navy, send them this video right now. Let's get into it. For months, one American carrier has been doing the job of an entire fleet. The USS Abraham Lincoln has spent well over 260 days at sea, holding position, launching sorties, and keeping pressure on Iran without a single day of real rest. Sailors on board have been living the same routine for nearly 9 months straight. Wake up, work, fly missions, sleep, repeat. No port calls that matter, no real break. Just an endless loop of vigilance in one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet. That kind of deployment isn't sustainable, and everyone in the Navy knows it. Ships need maintenance, sailors need rest. Equipment wears down faster than people realize when it's running around the clock in desert heat and salt air. So when word came that a second carrier, the USS George Washington, was finally moving to relieve the Lincoln, it wasn't just a routine rotation, it was a message, and Iran read that message loud and clear. To really understand why this single ship movement matters so much, it helps to step back and look at how rare this kind of overlap actually is. The United States Navy doesn't have an unlimited supply of carriers ready to deploy at a moment's notice. At any given time, only a handful of the Navy's 11 carriers are actually available for deployment. The rest are in maintenance cycles, training workups, or scheduled downtime that can take months or even years to complete. Moving a second carrier into an active theater while the first one is still on station isn't something that happens casually. It requires planning, resources, and a level of commitment that signals something far beyond routine rotation. Every carrier deployment also comes with an enormous logistics chain most people never think about. Fuel, food, spare parts, ammunition, all of it has to keep flowing to a moving target in the middle of the ocean. Support ships, refueling vessels, and supply lines stretch back thousands of miles to keep a strike group fully operational. Committing to a second full deployment on top of an already extended one means committing all of that supporting infrastructure too. This isn't a decision made lightly, and it isn't a decision made without a very clear understanding of what message it sends to everyone watching. Here's why this matters so much. An aircraft carrier isn't just a ship. It's a floating airbase, a small city, and a statement of intent all rolled into one. It carries dozens of fighter jets, early warning aircraft, helicopters, and enough firepower to reshape the security picture of an entire region the moment it arrives. When one carrier leaves and another arrives to take its place, that's normal operations. But when a second carrier moves in while the first one is still there, even briefly, that's a completely different signal. For a short window, 2 carrier strike groups could be operating in or near the same waters Iran has spent years claiming as its own backyard. Iran's leadership built its entire military doctrine around one core idea, that the Strait of Hormuz belongs to them, and that any nation moving through it does so only because Iran allows it. Officials have said this publicly over and over for years. It's not just rhetoric either. Iran has built an extensive network of coastal missile batteries, small fast attack boats, and radar installations specifically designed to make that choke point painful for anyone who tries to challenge it. The entire strategy rests on the idea that Iran, not the United States, decides who moves through those waters. That idea is about to get tested in a very public way. Because right now, President Trump has gone even further than previous administrations, suggesting that the United States could effectively treat the Strait as an area under American control, not Iranian permission. Whether or not that becomes official policy, the message alone lands hard in Tehran. It tells Iran's leadership that the calculation they've relied on for decades, that America values stability more than confrontation, might not hold the way it used to. So picture the scene inside Iran's military command structure right now. Analysts are watching satellite tracking data. They know the George Washington passed through the Strait of Malacca days ago and is now cutting across the Indian Ocean toward the Arabian Sea. They know exactly how many fighter jets a carrier like this can generate in a single day of flight operations. They know what it means for their own coastal defenses if 2 American strike groups end up operating in the same theater, even temporarily. And they know they don't have a real answer for it. That's the tension sitting underneath everything happening right now. Iran has spent years building a strategy based on asymmetric warfare, cheap drones, fast boats, hidden missile batteries, because it can't match the United States ship for ship or jet for jet. That strategy works reasonably well against a single carrier operating under restraint. It becomes a much harder problem when the other side signals it's willing to double down instead of pulling back. It's worth understanding why Iran chose asymmetric warfare as its core strategy in the first place, because the reasoning actually makes a lot of sense from Tehran's point of view. Building a navy capable of matching American carrier groups ship for ship would cost more than Iran's entire annual defense budget many times over, and it still wouldn't guarantee success against decades of American naval experience and technology. So instead, Iran invested in a different kind of deterrent. Thousands of small, cheap, fast attack boats that can swarm a target from multiple directions at once, mobile missile batteries that can hide, fire, and disappear before a response arrives, and increasingly, drones and underwater vehicles that cost a fraction of what it takes to defend against them. This approach has a name in military strategy circles, asymmetric deterrence, and for years, it worked reasonably well as a psychological deterrent, even without a single major engagement to prove it. The mere possibility of hundreds of small boats swarming a carrier, or missiles emerging from hidden coastal positions, was often enough to shape how cautiously American forces operated in the region. But deterrence built on possibility instead of proven capability has a fundamental weakness. It only works as long as the other side treats the threat as credible enough to avoid testing it directly. The moment someone decides to test it anyway, the whole strategy either proves itself or collapses in front of everyone watching. If you're starting to feel the tension building here, that's exactly the point, because what happens next explains why this moment matters more than any single carrier movement in years. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this channel reaches, and stay with me, because the numbers behind this deployment are honestly staggering. Before we get into the hardware, it's worth remembering why the timing of this specific deployment feels different from previous carrier rotations in the region. This isn't happening in a quiet stretch of calm diplomacy. It's happening right after weeks of heightened tension, tanker incidents, and public statements from both governments that have already raised the temperature considerably. Context changes everything about how a routine military rotation gets read by the other side. And right now, nothing about this moment reads as routine. Let's talk about what the George Washington actually brings to the table, because the scale of it is hard to fully picture unless you break it down. A Nimitz-class carrier like this one can carry more than 60 aircraft at once. F-18 Super Hornets for strike missions. E-2D Hawkeyes providing airborne early warning, essentially flying radar stations that can track hundreds of targets at once from hundreds of miles away. Helicopters for rescue and anti-submarine work. And beneath the surface, though you'll never see it on camera. A strike group like this typically travels with at least one attack submarine, quietly shadowing the formation, ready to respond to any threat approaching from below the waves. All of that adds up to something simple but important. A single carrier strike group can generate more combat air power in a day than most entire national air forces can field on their best day. And Iran knows this because it's watched the Lincoln do exactly that for the better part of a year. Here's where the psychology gets interesting. Iran's government has tried, publicly and repeatedly, to frame the extended Lincoln deployment as a sign of American overreach, a military stretched too thin, sailors exhausted, morale cracking. Some of that narrative got picked up by international media, including stories built around comments attributed to family members of deployed sailors, describing stress and strain from the long deployment. It's an understandable human story. Deployments that long are genuinely hard on families. But turning individual stress into a claim about the entire mission's viability is a very different thing, and it conveniently ignores the simplest explanation available. The Lincoln stayed because the mission required it, and now a second carrier is arriving specifically to make sure that presence never has to shrink. That's the part Iran's messaging can't really spin. If exhaustion and strain were actually breaking the deployment, the answer wouldn't be sending another full carrier strike group into the region. It would be pulling back. Instead, the opposite is happening, and that tells you everything about which version of the story is actually true. Meanwhile, on the ground and along the coastline, Iran has spent recent months building out its layered defense network. Underwater unmanned vehicles designed to move quietly beneath the surface. Coastal radar systems built to detect stealth aircraft approaching from over the horizon. Mobile missile batteries tucked into hardened bunkers along the coast, some hidden well enough that even detailed satellite imagery takes real work to spot them. On paper, it looks like a serious deterrent. In practice, every one of those systems depends on Iran choosing the right moment to use them, and every one of those systems can be found, tracked, and neutralized if that moment ever actually arrives. There's also a broader signal buried inside all of this that's worth pausing on. Task forces built specifically around one-way attack drones, systems designed to operate from the air, on the surface, and underwater simultaneously, have quietly been assembling in the region. This isn't just about countering Iran's missile batteries anymore. It's about denying Iran the one advantage it's always relied on, the ability to strike quickly, disappear, and force the other side to react. When your opponent builds a task force specifically designed to hunt drones and unmanned vehicles before they can be used, the whole equation around asymmetric warfare starts to shift. If you're finding this breakdown useful, do me a favor and share it with one person who still thinks a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz would only last a few days. Historically, blockades like this have lasted years, not weeks, and understanding that changes how you see everything happening right now. All right, let's keep going, because the next part explains exactly why Iran's options here are more limited than its public statements suggest. It also helps to look at how this moment compares to past flashpoints between Iran and the United States, because history here isn't short on tension. Over the years, there have been intercepted fighter jets testing borders, drone shootdowns, tanker seizures, and coastal strikes that came dangerously close to full-scale conflict without ever quite tipping over. Each time, both sides found a way to step back from the edge, sometimes through back-channel diplomacy, sometimes simply because neither side wanted to be the one that escalated first. That pattern has held for decades, and it's part of why so many analysts assumed this deployment would follow the same script: visible pressure, careful signaling, but ultimately restraint on both sides. What makes this moment feel different is the combination of factors arriving at once. It isn't just a second carrier. It's a second carrier arriving alongside explicit statements about American control of the Strait, alongside a drone hunting task force quietly building in the region, alongside extended deployment that's already stretched patience on every side. Any one of these developments alone might have been absorbed into the usual pattern of pressure and restraint. Together, they create something that feels less like routine posturing and more like a genuine shift in how this standoff gets managed going forward. Let's think through this from Iran's side for a moment, because that's really the only way to understand why panic is the right word for what's happening in Tehran right now. Iran's leadership has three basic options when a second American carrier enters the region, and none of them are particularly good. Option one is to escalate. Iran could use its coastal missile batteries, its fast attack boats, or its underwater drones to directly challenge American shipping or naval assets in the Strait. The problem with this option is simple. Every time Iran has tested American resolve with a limited strike in recent years, the response has been faster, harder, and more precise than Iranian planners expected. Coastal radar sites get found and destroyed within hours. Missile batteries that took months to position get eliminated in a single night. Escalation doesn't just risk failure, it risks losing entire categories of military capability that took years and enormous resources to build. There's also a deeper risk buried inside the escalation option that rarely gets discussed openly. Every time Iran uses one of its hidden systems against American forces, it reveals information about that system, how it's positioned, how it communicates, how quickly it can be brought online. American intelligence gathers and studies every one of those data points, building a clearer picture of Iran's actual capabilities with each attempted strike. In a strange way, escalation doesn't just risk immediate losses, it slowly erodes the very unpredictability that made Iran's asymmetric strategy effective in the first place. Every failed or partially successful strike teaches the other side something new, and that knowledge doesn't disappear once the smoke clears. Option two is to do nothing and hope the moment passes. This is, in some ways, the path Iran has taken for months already, absorbing pressure, making public statements, but avoiding direct confrontation with American forces. The problem here is that doing nothing while a second carrier moves into the region doesn't just maintain the status quo, it reinforces a new reality, one where the United States can operate with two full strike groups in the region without meaningful pushback. Every month that passes without a real challenge to that presence makes the next escalation attempt even riskier, because American forces have that much more time to adapt, reposition, and prepare. Option three is negotiation, using the pressure of this deployment as leverage to extract concessions at the table instead of on the battlefield. This is probably the most rational option available, and it's likely part of what's actually happening behind closed doors right now, even if it never makes it into public statements. But negotiating from a position of visible military weakness is never comfortable for a government that has spent decades building its entire domestic legitimacy around the idea of standing up to American power. Every day this deployment continues, that internal contradiction gets harder to manage. This is really what panic looks like at the level of a government, not chaos in the streets, but a leadership team staring at three options, none of which protect both their military capability and their public narrative at the same time. Every choice costs something, and for the first time in a long time, Iran's traditional strategy of patient, asymmetric pressure doesn't have an obvious answer to a second carrier arriving on schedule, fully supplied, and clearly not going anywhere. Quick pause here, because if this kind of breakdown is helping things click into place for you, that's honestly the whole reason I make these videos. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you don't miss the follow-up when the George Washington actually reaches the region, and let me know in the comments which of Iran's three options you think they'll actually choose. I read every single one. There's also a simpler, more human piece of the story worth remembering, because it's easy to lose sight of it in all the strategic analysis. On the American side, thousands of sailors have spent the better part of a year away from home, missing birthdays, missing anniversaries, running the same routines day after day in extreme heat, doing a job most people back home will never fully understand. Whatever tension exists at the geopolitical level, it's real people carrying the weight of it on every side of this story. The families waiting at home, the young sailors standing watch at 3 a.m, the analysts in Tehran trying to read satellite data and guess what happens next. None of this is abstract to the people actually living it. Think about what a single day actually looks like for a sailor on a carrier that's been at sea for over 260 days straight. Flight operations start before sunrise and often run well past midnight. Every takeoff and landing on that deck is one of the most dangerous routine operations in the entire military. Jets landing at high speed on a runway that's shorter than most people's driveways feel long with barely any room for error. And they do it again and again, day after day, for months without a real break. The physical toll alone is enormous, let alone the mental weight of knowing that somewhere along that coastline, someone is watching, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to test their resolve. And on Iran's side, there's a similar human reality that rarely gets discussed. The coastal defense crews manning those hidden missile batteries aren't faceless symbols of a regime. They're young men, often conscripted, standing watch along a coastline, waiting for orders that may never come, or that may come too late to matter. Many of them have grown up hearing the same narrative their entire lives, that the strait belongs to Iran, that American ships pass through only by permission. Watching that narrative get quietly challenged by nothing more than a ship sailing calmly toward the horizon puts pressure on more than just the generals making decisions in Tehran. It puts pressure on every single person whose sense of purpose was built around defending a claim that increasingly looks difficult to enforce. Understanding a conflict like this means holding both truths at once. The strategic chess game happening at the highest levels of government, and the very real people caught inside that game on every side. So where does this actually leave things right now, with one carrier already exhausted from months of continuous operations, and a second one closing the distance every single day? The honest answer is that nobody outside a small circle of decision makers knows exactly what happens next, and that uncertainty is precisely the point. Ambiguity is a tool, keeping Iran guessing about exactly when the George Washington arrives, exactly how long the overlap with the Lincoln will last, and exactly what rules of engagement apply during that window. All of that uncertainty adds pressure without requiring a single shot to be fired. That's ultimately the quiet power of a deployment like this. It doesn't need a headline grabbing airstrike to send a message. The message is the ship itself, tracked on every open source intelligence platform, visible to satellites, impossible to hide, and impossible to ignore. Every mile it covers between the Strait of Malacca and the Arabian Sea is a mile closer to a moment Iran has been trying to avoid for years. A moment where its carefully built narrative of controlling the region's most important waterway runs directly into the reality of what's actually sailing toward it. Here's the thing people often miss about moments like this. The real story isn't really about whether missiles get fired or whether a blockade actually happens. It's about what a government does when its entire strategic identity gets challenged by nothing more dramatic than a ship changing course. Iran has spent decades cultivating an image of unpredictability, of being willing to escalate faster and further than anyone expects. That image only works as long as nobody calls the bluff directly. A second carrier, arriving calmly, on schedule, without fanfare, without an ultimatum, is arguably a more direct challenge to that image than any single strike could ever be, because it doesn't ask Iran to react. It simply exists, patiently in the water Iran claims to control, and dares that claim to mean something. There's a concept in military strategy, sometimes called presence deterrence, the idea that simply existing in a contested space, without firing a single shot, can shift the entire balance of a standoff. It's a quieter form of power than a missile strike, but in some ways a more effective one, because it can't be answered with a single dramatic response. You can't retaliate against a ship for doing nothing but sailing where it's legally allowed to sail. You can't justify an attack on a carrier that hasn't fired a weapon, without inviting a response that would dwarf whatever damage you managed to inflict. Presence deterrence works precisely because it removes the easy justification for escalation, forcing the other side to either accept the new reality or manufacture a reason to reject it. And manufactured reasons rarely hold up well once the world starts watching closely. This is also why open source intelligence has become such a powerful force in moments like this. Every port call, every transit through a major strait, every satellite image of a carrier's flight deck gets tracked, shared, and analyzed by thousands of independent observers around the world within hours. There's no way to quietly move a carrier strike group anymore, no way to keep its position a secret from anyone who wants to know. That transparency cuts both ways, of course, but in a standoff like this one, it strips away Iran's ability to control the narrative around what's actually happening. The ship's position isn't a matter of official statements or state media. It's a matter of public record, updated constantly, visible to anyone with an internet connection. And that's really the story sitting underneath every headline about panic in Tehran right now. It was never really about one ship replacing another. It's about what happens when a country builds its entire identity around controlling a stretch of water, and then has to watch, in real time, tracked by anyone with an internet connection, as the world's most powerful navy proves that control was always more claim than reality. The carrier doesn't need to fire a single shot to make that point. It just needs to keep sailing and then has to watch exactly in real time, tracked by anyone with an internet connection. An entire region as the world's most powerful navy proves that control was always more claim than reality. It's also worth thinking about what happens after this specific moment passes. It just needs to keep sailing
carriers
forward.
don't stay in one place forever.
And eventually, one of these two strike groups will entire region holds its breath. The real question isn't just how Iran responds to this particular deployment. It's the opening chapter of a longer shift in how much standard where the United States simply maintains a heavier, more visible presence. Every analyst watching the region going forward is asking rather than treating it as a temporary surge. Does Iran the direction things are heading? This new reality, and this moment isn't really about one carrier passing another, adjusting its rhetoric. It's the opening chapter of a longer shift in how much room Iran actually has to operate the way it always has. Every analyst watching the situation is asking some version of the same question. Does Iran quietly absorb this new reality the way it has absorbed pressure before, adjusting its rhetoric while keeping its actual strategy intact? Or does something about this specific combination of factors, the timing, the language coming out of Washington, the drone hunting task forces, the sheer visibility of it all, push things toward an actual confrontation neither side particularly wants, but neither side can find a way to avoid? Nobody knows the answer yet, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment worth watching so closely. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines, that's exactly why this channel exists. So consider subscribing before you go, because there's a lot more unfolding in this region in the days ahead, and you'll want to see it as it happens. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz depends on choices that haven't been made yet, choices being weighed right now by people under enormous pressure on every side of this story. But one thing is already certain. The old assumption that Iran controls this stretch of water simply because it says so is being tested in the most direct way possible, not with words, but with steel, moving steadily across the ocean, day after day, mile after mile, until it arrives exactly where it was always headed. Years from now, when people look back at this stretch of time in the Strait of Hormuz, they probably won't remember the exact date that George Washington crossed into the Arabian Sea, or the precise wording of a statement made in Washington. What they'll remember is the shift, the moment a decades-old assumption about who really controls that water quietly stopped holding up under pressure. Not because of a dramatic battle, not because of a single headline grabbing strike, but because a second carrier kept sailing forward exactly as planned, until the claim standing in its way had nowhere left to hide. That's the real story behind every carrier deployment like this one. It's never just about the ship. It's about what the ship represents the moment it arrives, a test of whether years of rhetoric can survive contact with reality. Right now, that test is still unfolding, tracked in real time by anyone paying attention, and the outcome will shape how this region operates for years to come. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.